Welcome back to the Academy Table. I'm Renee DeSilva, CEO of the Academy and your host, and I'm happy to have you back with us again today. In each episode of the table, I'll bring you real conversations with healthcare's best leaders and thinkers. We want to broaden who is at the table while covering the issues that are critical for driving our industry forward. In today's conversation, I welcome my friend and colleague Brian Regan to the table. Brian is a general partner and head of healthcare at Welsh, Carson, Anderson & Stowe. Welsh Carson is a private equity firm with more than 40 years of investing in a series of influential healthcare and technology companies. I've had the pleasure of getting to know Brian across the last 2.5 years as part of the Welsh Carson strategic partnership with the Academy. He has such a unique view and incisive sense of where the industry is going. And so in our conversation today, we cover a lot of ground. We start by talking about the evolving private equity landscape, including Welsh Carson's process for evaluating potential investments or de novo opportunities, as well as the hallmarks of the most successful partnerships. Midway through, we make a little bit of a transition into a broader discussion on leadership. One of the things that's unique about Brian is his board service. He sits on 7 companies, including the Academy, and has unique access and insight into what makes an effective CEO and leadership team at scale. We cover the role of leaders in cultivating diverse talent, where Brian articulates both the moral imperative and the business case for doing so. With that, let's head to the table. Brian, welcome to the Academy Table. So happy to have you this afternoon.
It's great to be here.
Brian, let me start by throwing a few figures at you. In 1979, the year Welsh Carson closed its first fund, total PE deal value was about $250 million. If we were to fast forward to 2019, that volume hit $80 billion in healthcare alone. How would you describe the nature of this investment, and how should we understand its growth as an industry?
Look, I think what's happened, generally speaking, over time is that large, predominantly starting with the U.S. pension funds, and then expanding over time to foreign sovereign wealth funds, university endowments, large wealthy individuals, insurance companies, and the like, have recognized that diverse portfolio that includes exposure to both public securities, be it stocks or bonds, and alternative assets is a way for them to fulfill their obligations to their constituents, which, in our case, we've got a number of very large public pension funds, CalPERS, CalSTRS, New York City, state of Connecticut, that have these long-term structural retirement obligations that they need to meet. And so they need to generate returns in order to satisfy those. And for a very long time, private equity has provided an opportunity for them to enhance their overall portfolio returns by investing in largely private businesses. We do a bit of both, but largely private businesses. And so the industry has grown up sort of alongside that mandate and evolved quite a bit, particularly I'd say over the last 20 years or so, where you've seen firms increase the kind of talent that we have around the table. So not just investors, but folks in our resources group, for example, that have operating backgrounds or consulting backgrounds that help our companies grow. And it's become a fairly efficient way for the market overall to allocate capital. It's been a helpful way for particularly smaller and mid-sized companies that don't want to have the cost or all the distraction of being a public company to get capital in order to grow or to provide liquidity to a founder or to a family. And so you've had a combination of factors. You've had the incremental sort of professionalization of the industry, as well as this continued need for our large limited partners to generate returns.
So with that level set, if you thought about the landscape from the lens of a large health system, how would you educate a leader about where capital is flowing and where the investment opportunities have emerged?
Yeah, so I think on the first point, in terms of where capital is flowing, healthcare used to be somewhat niche-y from a private equity investment perspective. it contains some attributes that on the face of it don't necessarily make it a logical place to invest, especially for large or diversified firms that are looking, across the world for opportunities and across different sectors. It's got a regulatory overlay to it. It has an oversight component to it. There's certainly stroke of the pen risk, and there are some firms that have shied away from, last mile healthcare. But over the last, 20 years, it's accelerated to where it represents, close to, rough numbers, 20% of our economy. So it's too big to ignore. And so I think one of the things that has driven deal making in healthcare particularly is that you've had funds reorganize themselves as initially were generalists, meaning the same partner might invest in multiple industries. They've organized themselves into sector teams. And so all the large cap private equity funds, KKR, Blackstone, folks like that have dedicated healthcare efforts. And then you have specialists like Welsh Carson that only invest in healthcare and technology. And then you move down market and you have even more specialists. We're a little bit unique for our size with a $4 to $5 billion individual fund to just invest in two industries. So again, one of the major trends that's happened in terms of allocation of capital towards healthcare is that you've moved away over the last 20 years or so that I've been in the business from more of a generalist model to even within firms that invest across all sectors, they have dedicated sector specific teams. So the number of people out there with a mandate to deploy capital in healthcare has increased. Now, if you look at, the Bain benchmarking data on healthcare private equity, a lot of that has gone into pharma. A lot of that has gone into pharma-related, mostly services, so contract research, contract development. It's gone into healthcare IT, which is a business model a lot of large private equity understand because they also invest in software just like we do. And then you have the provider space, which has represented, call it 75% of our investing activity, but maybe only 50 to 60% of the overall market. And that does still reflect a little bit of a reticence for some private equity firms to get into investments that involve the actual provision of clinical care. But I do think increasingly, you see investments in and around emerging business models. It's typically specialized. In other words, it's imaging centers or it's ambulatory surgery centers or it's oncology as a service line versus health systems, kind of broadly defined. So it tends to be specialized. And, for our perspective, in terms of how providers or systems could benefit from that or harness it, we do most of our provider investing is done alongside of large health systems, whether that's co-investing at the company level or whether it's joint ventures at the local level. And, you go back to like the mid 90s when we started USPI with Baylor in Dallas. And we've had a whole series of investments, Select Medical, Concentra, US Radiology, US Acute Care, that have used either a local joint venture approach or a company level co-investment approach to involve other key constituents, and namely the systems in those businesses.
Yeah, I think that's great. So one of the takeaways for me as you're speaking through this, if I were the lens of questions that board members should be thinking about, and also just how CEOs are animating on this, is this notion of finding good models of partnership and being willing to approach that. As you mentioned, and that data point was helpful. So much of Welsh Carson's history has been rooted in this notion of good partnerships. Let's talk about that a bit more. So when you think about the power of strategic partnerships, and probably both being differentiated on the front end, but also finding value across the relationship, what comes to mind for you in terms of maybe the hallmarks of the most successful partnerships?
So to me, it starts with alignment. And I think that exists or needs to exist if you're going to be successful on several levels. One certainly comes back to equity ownership. And again, that could reside locally in a joint venture, or it could be at the company level. But having shared ownership is generally the best way to ensure alignment. Having a shared vision for what that asset should do, can do, could be, So having a strategic plan, having a formal planning process around how you're going to achieve that. I think having alignment on values is important. We're very respectful of the fact that nonprofit systems are stewards of, community resources, and that they can and should have guardrails around, quality, around patient satisfaction, around patient experience, both clinical and financial. And so I think laying as much of that out up front as possible, being as explicit as possible around that, is probably the most important determinant of whether your partnership is going to succeed or fail. I think determining who the partners are, if you look at healthcare, any given transaction involves multiple constituents. You've got the hospital, you've got the surgeon, you've got the anesthesiologist, you've got the device manufacturer, you've got the insurer, you've got the patient, you've got the employer, the insurer's operating as an ASO. So thinking about, where you want to play, and then what are the key constituents that you want involved in your partnership, I think that selection process is incredibly important in terms of having a constructive partnership.
I've also noted, so when you look at the broader landscape of where Welsh Carson has invested, you've got these examples of where maybe you took an existing asset and found ways to accelerate and to really invest in and build behind the management team. But I also think there have been some interesting examples of de novo opportunities that were grounded in policy or maybe other reads of the market where there was an unmet opportunity. Can you talk a little bit about that? How do you identify opportunities, particularly around maybe where some of these policy gaps are, and just the notion of business building de novo and how you all have approached that?
Yeah. So we go through a process we call map and attack, and it's evolved over time. And the current iteration of that, I actually, recently, Renee, as you know, assumed leadership for our healthcare group here at Welsh Carson, and we sort of democratized that process. So I challenged our entire group to think creatively and come up with new ideas that sort of sit at the intersection of three things. One is we want to identify a space that has positive secular trend or a particular need. And as you referenced, that could be policy driven, it could be market demand driven, it could be innovation driven, it could be economy of scale driven in terms of consolidation. And then we want to identify those sectors that have actionable assets for us. So as you know, we're largely a control investor. So we need to have companies that are investable, meaning of a particular size, or who are interested in taking private equity capital. Unlike a hedge fund that can just go buy a share of any public company, we have to have a willing seller. And a willing seller that has certain size parameters given the size of our fund. And then finally, we have to have a reason why Welsh Carson is going to be different, because we're operating in a competitive environment. And so a lot of people have a lot of money. We want to understand what is our angle to win. And so that's the process we go through to identify those themes. Particularly on your policy question, Tom Scully, former CMS administrator, former OMB healthcare pad in the original Bush administration, has been here for 17 years. He's been a partner for 15. He's got phenomenal connections in DC, and is really sort of a career healthcare technocrat who has, I think, incredibly sort of reinvented himself too as an investor. And we've spent a lot of time and a lot of resources on connectivity, whether it's to the administration, whether it's to Congress. We've got a pretty broad engagement program around members of Congress. We're highly interested in what key committees of jurisdiction are doing. We follow the literature around where policy innovations might occur. There's obviously a formal structure for that now within CMS with CMMI. So we've invested quite a bit in our DC footprint in order to gain insights about where the government is heading.
So if I play that back, you have a process to think creatively about where you ought to deploy capital. And then you have investments that are in mind from a policy perspective to understand where those opportunities lie in the long term. I think some good examples of those coalescing are around Springstone and also InnovAge. I'd love to hear more around, as we move forward, how do you think about continuing to stay current on opportunities? And how do you do that in the context of administration transitions and how that impacts how policy gets played out?
One of the key hires that we just made is Adeze Inequichi, and she was the healthcare OMB lead within the White House for the Obama administration and had a key role in the implementation of Obamacare. She's been involved in Democrat healthcare policy circles for most of her career, has a really deep network. The Biden administration is largely populated on the healthcare side by alumni of the Obama administration, not surprisingly. And so we've continued to invest in that area and to look for resources in addition to Tom, who's stayed incredibly connected, for others to complement him. So there is a continual process of making sure that we have the right components as part of that policy assessment strategy, and then they can connect the dots to activity and positioning both within our portfolio as well as our new deal activity. So Adeze joins us in June. We're really excited to have her on board.
That's great. I look
and
forward
for your help, by the way, Renee,
yes.
in recruiting her.
Yes. So, that does bring us to, you were talking about in the partnership part of our discussion around looking for organizations that have a positive secular trend or need and places where you can make a significant investment. There's one exception to that, which would be the Academy. So just for the purpose of the audience, I've gotten to know you through, you made the general partners of Welsh Carson, not through the fund, made a strategic investment in the Academy in 2017. And I joined the Academy in large part because of that transition. So talk a little bit about the exception to the rule. So what was interesting to you about the Academy, and how do you think about the rationale for this partnership and the spirit of all that Welsh Carson does?
Yeah. Well, first and foremost, it's been a really rewarding and I think productive partnership that just passed the 3-year anniversary mark, which is kind of incredible. And greatly appreciate your leadership and the really fantastic development that we've seen, the growth and evolution of that business, the connectivity to our systems during COVID, I think was incredible. What we try to think about is how are we going to produce first quartile returns on a sustainable basis, meaning fund after fund, for our limited partners. That's our primary product, is our returns. And sustainability is a challenge in our business when you've got lots of very smart people with lots of capital. And so it comes down to what are our sources of sustainable competitive differentiation. And ultimately in our business, that's a function of the talent you have, although that's sometimes hard to differentiate, but it's also your intellectual property you've accumulated over time, your track record, where we do think we're objectively different given a 40-year history, and your network and your connections. And so the Academy really fits into two of those. It's a wonderful source of intellectual property for us about what systems are doing in the market, how they're thinking about the world, what their needs are, where they would like to deploy capital, where they might perceive they need a partner. But then also you've got this whole ecosystem of industry customers, as you call them, or industry members, who are doing interesting and innovative things that may be opportunities for investment by us. So on one hand, we've got our primary objective most days is to try to find attractive new investment opportunities and to differentiate Welsh Carson to the sellers of those companies relative to the other people that are trying to bring them money. And so having the Academy and just generally understanding our ecosystem and having a deeper domain expertise in healthcare relative to others, the Academy contributes to that, and I think increasingly will. And then the other is the network. And, if we're seeing something interesting in the space, maybe it has a joint venture model with systems, maybe it has developed innovative technology or services that can help systems, be able to tap into that and to talk to senior folks across our health system members, to give them opportunities to invest, to give them opportunities to joint venture, to help help us think through that. We found that increasingly can be a real win-win for both us and for the Academy. So that the network is important and the IP is particularly important.
I agree. I also think just where we find ourselves as an industry, I think the appetite for conversations in both executive forums that we convene, as well as even just in boardrooms, has really never been higher to understand what's happening outside of the provider org. And I think the Welsh Carson connection for us has been a great way to make that happen at scale. So I'm happy to be on this journey with you.
It's been good. And I think more of that's to come, right? I mean, if you think about the challenges that our businesses are facing, we operate, just so people know, we have about 15 portfolio companies. That's about average. Those companies have, $13, $14 billion in revenue. We employ 110,000 people and we treat 25 million patients a year. So if you aggregate our portfolio together, when we look at the world, we don't do everything end to end like your system members would, but we do a lot of the slices. And so thoughts that we have, considerations we have, opportunities we have, whether it's around efficiency or patient experience or, clinical recruiting. I mean, you kind of name the topic and we have quite a bit of overlap because effectively we're operating somewhat of a large geographically distributed, deconstructed health system at any given time. And so I think a lot of the considerations, a lot of the strategy, how we deal with, increased share of our patient population as government beneficiaries, how we respond to some commercial pricing pressure, how we protect patients from, large financial responsibility, things like that. Those are all considerations that we have as well. So in effect, I think we're kind of working through all this stuff together. And I think that provides lots of opportunities both to mitigate risk and to capture opportunity.
I'd love to switch gears for the second part of our discussion. Given where you sit, the number of boards that you serve on, you work with, coach, evaluate performance of executives regularly. This gives you, I would imagine, a particularly unique view into what the most successful leaders look like. And so, at the risk of me asking you these questions, when in some ways I feel like you also opine on my own performance, I'm going to ask you for, objectively speaking, nothing to do with the current conversation that we're having. But when you think about the characteristics of highly effective CEOs, what comes to mind?
So I think the number one determinant of whether CEOs are successful, particularly in larger organizations at scale, it's the quality of the team that they build. And it's the depth and breadth of the talent they have around them, the manner in which they develop that talent, the manner in which they hold that team accountable. That to me is far and away probably the biggest job of a CEO. And the job of a board, frankly, is really, you could probably boil it down to making sure the company has the right CEO. I mean, there's certainly considerations around capital allocation strategy and for us exit timing and other things, but a lot of that does come down to, who's leading the business and how are they building a team that can navigate, uncertainty, that can execute against a strategic plan, that can operate, particularly in healthcare, in a regulated environment where there's a good portion of the population that believes that healthcare is a social good. And so you've got to be sensitive to all those dynamics. I think in healthcare, particularly that EQ, particularly, dealing with physicians, for example, which a lot of our businesses do in some form or fashion, even if they're not, physician services platforms. I think, being a clear communicator, a basic level of trust and credibility that you can establish with those folks. Most of our CEOs are highly relational people, that relatively high EQ. And then, I think finally, just a focus on results. And, private equity is sort of the ultimate, meritocracy and accountability business. At the end of the day, like, I get judged on two things: how much capital did I deploy, and what rate of return did we earn on that? It is, unbelievably objective. And so we tend to gravitate to CEOs that have a similar mindset, that they establish, aspirational but realistic targets for their team. They build that team in such a way that they can accomplish those targets. They hold people accountable, and they're creative, they're resilient, but they're ultimately objective-oriented thinkers. And that's not an easy thing. It's sort of lonely, being at the top sometimes. So the other thing that we try to do, and I think the Academy does a lot of this through the peer network, but is to develop boards where those CEOs have an outlet, not just to me or one of my partners as the financial sponsor, but to a CEO or retired CEO who's done it before in that space, or somebody they can reach out to, because we certainly recognize there's a unique sort of culmination of responsibility and accountability at that CEO level. So our objective is to make that person successful, because if we are, the company's going to be successful.
Yeah, I think that's great. I've also just enjoyed part of my role at the Academy is I feel like I can be a student of effective CEOs, and I spend a lot of time with our both industry and health system members. And some of the things that have landed with me over the last couple of years has been, some are really effective at tuning out the noise and getting to really what matters quickly. I really respect that trait. I've heard many of our CEOs talk about sometimes the risk of when, especially when you're new in a CEO position, is that you spend time on the things that you like to do, not always really where you should be focused. You sometimes can be too slow in processing through human resources issues. So I do feel like the Academy platform has been a great learning lab for me, watching these folks, managing significant size, scope, complexity, and across the year of COVID, having to do that with agility and a high degree of resilience has been really a privilege in my mind to be able to watch. So I appreciate your sentiments there.
I think that's spot on, because I think one of the things that enables execution is to kind of create order and simplicity and focus out of chaos. And, if you're running a 10,000 person business or a 20,000 person business, the opportunity to get distracted is, almost infinite. And so I find myself spending a lot more time thinking about where I'm going to spend my time. And, we've used a process, as Renee, with the Academy on a, value maximization plan that really tries to focus our companies on what are the 3, maybe 5 key things that are going to make that company successful over the next 2 or 3 years. And it's often hard to look a lot longer than that. Our investment horizon isn't 2 or 3 years, but our planning horizon has kind of become 2 or 3 years. And then we've really tried to be deliberate about what are the big levers. And oftentimes you have to sort through a lot of stuff to get to those 2, 3, 4 things that you're going to do really well. And then you have to be very deliberate about what you're not going to do. Because again, it's really easy for organizations to get distracted. It's easy for organizations to get bogged down in change management. And at the end of the day, for even big companies, the diameter of the pipe that you're trying to fit all this, innovation and evolution and other stuff through is only so wide. And so being very thoughtful about where you're headed, make sure everybody understands that, make sure you're communicating that. Those are some of the things that I've found, just even in our own business, are incredibly important when you're dealing with, the complexity of running a large private equity portfolio or an integrated health system that's got, 15 or 20 service lines. Understanding what's really important and narrowing down your focus on those things and dedicating what I'll call a proportionate amount of your time, meaning what should be most of it, to those things. I think that's a big differentiator.
I think that's right. So just staying on the talent, taking it in a bit of a different direction, you and I probably last year started to have some what I would call really candid conversations around race and equity and inclusion, and maybe a way that I don't know that we would have necessarily had that conversation if there was not a broader national dialogue that maybe prompted all of us to get out of our own comfort zone and sort of find our way navigating that. And one of the things I really have appreciated about the way that you've approached these conversations has been you're such a linear thinker, and you're very analytically oriented. And I thought you were spot on in terms of how you thought about the business case. There's certainly a social and maybe moral imperative around equity and inclusion and just grappling with the issues that are challenging for our country. But there's also the business case around equity, which I think you articulate really well. Can you comment on that, if you wouldn't mind?
Yeah, no, I appreciate those discussions. They're sometimes awkward to have. And I think we should admit that up front. You don't want to say something offensive. You want to be engaged, but it's difficult to have, but I think it's necessary to have. To me, I think it starts with and I've done a lot of reading on this, there's a real science-based case for, why diverse teams and diverse organizations tend to outperform. And, if you think about it, it's certainly the case in private equity. I think I'd argue it's probably the case in any business. Our primary output is returns, and our primary input to that is decision making. And groups that all think alike don't tend to produce the best decisions. And so if you back up or why people think alike, it's usually they have similar backgrounds, they have similar experiences, they probably look alike. And that takes on a lot of different forms. Certainly race and gender are two primary determinants, but there's a lot of others, including socioeconomic, that may or may not be tied to the first two. So one of the things that we've had a very deliberate strategy around is being more inclusive and making it a focus. And we're doing that, not just so we can put it on a ESG page in our, LP presentation, because I want my, our stats to look good, because we think that's an expectation of our LPs. It is an expectation of our LPs, and there's a lot of discussion around that. And I frankly think there's some downsides to the extent to which some of that's being imposed in our culture and society today versus the extent to which we've enabled some of the organic arguments to kind of come through, because I actually think that's more powerful. We're doing it because I want the return slide to look better. And that's ultimately what our constituents care about. They care about our returns and the manner in which we accomplish them. And I've just seen so many instances in which a deliberate focus on expanding the aperture and looking at, non-traditional candidates or candidates that, might not have been in the process historically, giving them an opportunity has produced just outstanding and sometimes unexpected results for us. And, it's hard in my business because the development cycles are long. It's a mentorship and apprenticeship business. The time from getting on a partnership track to becoming a partner is about 10 years. And so what you also need to do is start early and develop those folks and give them the kind of positive feedback that enabled you to get where you are. I find it's really easy to give that to somebody who probably does look like you or thinks like you or talks like you. It's actually harder to kind of reaffirm and project people that do look differently into a more senior role. But we have a couple of really outstanding young women who are investment professionals with us. And I tell them all the time, like, you should be running the firm in 10 years or 20 years. Their EQ is higher than mine at the same age, tremendous analytical ability. They played college sports and sort of understand teamwork. Their connectivity to their peers is incredible. And so we need to make sure that we're developing those folks at a young age, and that we're also helping them to see where they can get to within our organization.
Yeah, I love that. I talk a lot about this. I call it the power of the nudge, and noting in people things that you see that they might not yet see for themselves. And I think about my own career path and how at appropriate moments, without that nudge, I would have not even lifted my head up and imagined the possibilities. And you did this for me too, and not to be gratuitous in this conversation, but I was not necessarily, I think when I got the call to evaluate the Welsh Carson CEO opportunity, I passed on it. And then we had a conversation, and you sort of said, like, why would you not at least evaluate the opportunity fully before just, not feeling like the time was right for reasons that were more about loyalty to where I was versus not feeling like I could do the work. So I think there's a lot of power in the nudge. And I do think people should continue to find ways to expand their social network. So I appreciate that anecdote, Brian.
Yeah. Well, and what you also find too, Renee, and I referenced this a bit earlier with the conversation on Adeze, is when you have outstanding, diverse talent in your organization, they attract other outstanding, diverse talent. And if you're in a competitive environment for talent, which we all are, being the same as everybody else is not going, the way you generate first quartile returns. I didn't think about this, but I think Howard Marks wrote a memo on this. The way you generate first quartile returns is to be different than the other 75% of people. So if you only make the same investments as everybody else, you can never be, by definition, first quartile, because you'll just mimic their performance. You always revert to the mean or the median. The way you generate first quartile results consistently is to do things differently than your competitors are. And we're in kind of the ultimate relative performance game. And so if we just do things the same way, if we look the same, if we think the same, if we have the same, group of people, finance background, whatever, we're not going to perform differently than our competitors. And so if you approach the market from a different perspective, again, this is the business case, which I revert to on this. The flywheel effect gets you other unique talent that other people don't have access to. And so to me, that's really powerful. And I've seen the benefit of that in our organization. We've developed critical mass in this regard, or starting to. We can attract some different people because of that.
All right, I'm going to close us out. Final question, a bit of a hard pivot from our conversation. But so the intention around creating this podcast, the Academy Table, is to just broaden the voices and perspectives in the industry. And I just note that I think one of the things that we all miss most about this last year and a half of sort of being in quarantine is that you don't have the tables that are set with great food and great wine and good conversation. And so my question that I've been asking all of my guests is that if you were the head of the table and you could invite any two people for a conversation, fictional, dead, no longer alive, who would they be and why?
I'm going to invite my three deceased grandparents. My paternal grandfather was a wonderful mentor to me. He was first generation born in this country. He was fought in the Pacific on a Fletcher-class destroyer in World War II. He was an educator. He was a principal. He was a Renaissance man, even though he came from very, very humble beginnings in Dunmore, Pennsylvania. He was just an incredible influence on me. I never got to meet my maternal grandfather. He unfortunately passed away before my mom was even married. And then my maternal grandmother was just a wonderful person. She lived to 101. She was really caring and nurturing. And I had a really unique relationship with my grandparents. I was lucky to grow up within 5 minutes of all of them. And, now that I have a family of my own and a lot of hopefully cool stuff that's happened, I'm really fortunate in my life with my wife and my kids and my extended family and my friends. I'd love to just spend an evening catching up with them. So it's not the famous person answer. It's just an honest. I'd love to spend one more night with my pop and my grandmom, and then to meet my maternal grandfather for the first time.
That's perfect. Perfect. Well, Brian, I feel like I probably talked to you a couple times a week, but I definitely learned something through this conversation. So really grateful that you joined us today. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me. It's been great.
Thanks again for joining me at The Table. The Table is a podcast produced by the Health Management Academy. Make sure you catch future episodes by visiting our website, theacademytable.com, or by subscribing on the podcast platform of your choice. And if you have suggestions for topics or guests, I'd love to hear from you. Please drop me a note at renee@hmacademy.com. I look forward to talking with you soon.